life to India, where she spent 53 years of her life rescuing children, establishing an orphanage, school, and hospital, all of which continue today. Her early years were spent growing up in a small village called Millisle in Northern Ireland, a whitewashed village of cottages facing the Irish Sea. And she came from a moneyed family. Her father was a mill owner who built the local church, the local primary school. He was also a local evangelist as well, and he would lead services on Sunday evenings in the village of Millisle. And not being much of a preacher, he would simply stand up in front of the congregation and read the sermons of Charles Haddon Spurgeon, the great English Baptist preacher. Now, as a child, Amy Carmichael had the reputation of being quite adventurous, quite wild, and she loved to ride horses up and down the beaches of the Irish coast. And she and her brothers had a reputation for being quite wild as well. They didn't go to the local school, but instead they were taught by a governess, and the children made the lives of their governesses so unbearable that many came and went. One of Amy Carmichael's memories of her very early childhood was the realization that she didn't have blue eyes. And in later life, she would write a poem about this experience. She so longed to have blue eyes that as a 3-year-old, she prayed that the Lord would give her blue eyes. And so one night before she went to bed, she prayed that prayer. And she got up the next morning to discover that her prayer hadn't been answered. She had the same brown eyes as she went to bed with. And that sense of disappointment stayed with her for many years. But later, as a missionary in India, she would reflect upon that prayer prayed as a 3-year-old girl. And by this time in Amy Carmichael's life, she was rescuing children from what we today would call the sex trade, and to access the children who were being kept in local temples. She would dye her skin with coffee and she would put on a sari, and she was able to pass as a local. No one would take notice of her, partly because of her brown eyes. And she soon realized that if the Lord had answered her prayer and given her blue eyes, she would have been spotted as a European miles away. And her poem reflected on the fact that our God is a God of details, even down to the color of our eyes, or as the Old Testament puts it, the number of hairs on our head. Our God sees us and knows us to the finest of detail. The family moved up to Belfast after her father bought a new mill in the city. Amy instead was sent to a Methodist boarding school in England, where this wild streak in her only came out more and more. And yet it was in England that she attended what was known as a CSSM event, CSSM, short for Children's Special Service Mission. And CSSM beach missions were part of my Northern Ireland upbringing. And it was at one of these meetings that she received the Lord. I don't want us to underestimate what the Lord can do in the lives of children. A number of years ago at our church in Vevey, we had a year of hearing people's testimonies, 52 testimonies, hearing how people had come to faith in Jesus. And it was remarkable, the number of people who talked about their first encounter with Jesus being as a young child. Let's not underestimate what the Lord can do in the lives of children. Let's not give up praying for our children, give up praying for our grandchildren. But it wasn't long after that experience of coming to faith in Jesus that the tragedy struck the life of Amy Carmichael. And Amy found herself being whisked back to Belfast to discover that her father had suddenly died. And for the first time in her life, she faced grief with the loss of her father. And for the first time in her life, she faced the sudden burden of added responsibility in the family. And in Amy Carmichael's writings, suffering is a theme she spends quite a bit of time reflecting on, and she herself would fight a long battle with neuralgia, a debilitating, painful disease that would often leave her bedridden for days. And she would write this: God is the God of the waves and the billows, and they are still his when they come over us. And again, we have proved that the overwhelming thing does not overwhelm. Once more, by his interposition, deliverance came. We were cast down, but we were not destroyed. I have to say, I am struck by those words. The overwhelming thing does not overwhelm. I have to say that this week past, that is a word that I've heard a number of people use. I've heard a number of people say to me, I feel overwhelmed. And perhaps a number of us, because of these new measures that both have been introduced here in Switzerland and back in the UK, we have that sense of coming to the end of ourselves, running out of our own resources. And Amy Carmichael clearly knew those moments and clearly knew the Lord in those moments. And she was able to write again and again, we have proved that the overwhelming thing does not overwhelm. Back in Belfast, she and her brothers were walking back from church one Sunday morning when they encountered an elderly woman carrying a heavy burden. And so they helped this lady, they carried her bags, but literally also they carried the woman home. And as they were doing so, they passed a fountain. And as they were passing a fountain, something quite unusual happened. Amy Carmichael heard a voice. And the voice said this, and the fire shall try every man's work, of what sort it is, if any man's work abide. And she looked around and there was no one there. And she spent the rest of the day in her room praying, believing it to be the Lord. And this experience would settle the pattern of her life, sensing that God was calling her to serve the needs of others. And so she began to serve with the Belfast City Mission, an experience that would take her all over the city. And she began to be burdened by the plight of the mill girls, the girls working in the mills in Belfast. In Belfast, we used to call them millies, or I think in England, they used to be called shawlies, literally because instead of wearing a hat, they would put a shawl over their head. And so she borrowed a church and she began to gather these women and she would serve them tea and they would read the Bible together. And it got to the point that she had gathered over 500 of these girls who worked in the mill, so much so that they needed a bigger place. And she ended up being given a plot of land and she was given some money. And on that land was erected what was known as an iron hall, like a 19th century prefab. And it was named the Welcome Mission. 130 years later, that is still there today in Belfast. And at this stage in Amy Carmichael's life, she isn't even 20 years old yet. She would look back on that and she would describe that as her first step. And she would later say, he said to me, speaking of God, God said to me, go. And it seems to me that all he asks is that we would take the one step he shows us and in simple, most practical trust, leave all results to him. I'm someone, I like my roadmap. I like to know where I'm going. But sometimes the first step is all that the Lord is willing to show us. And then he calls us to trust him for the second and the third. Amy's work among mill girls became known outside of Northern Ireland, and she received a call from Christians in Manchester to come and to establish a similar outreach to mill girls in the city of Manchester. and that was in 1889. And it was there that she began to get involved with the Keswick Convention, and many of you will have heard of the Keswick Convention. And it was at the Keswick Convention that she heard Hudson Taylor speak. Many of us will know of Hudson Taylor, the founder of the China Inland Mission. And as she was hearing Hudson Taylor speak, it was at that point that she began to discern her call to mission. And the Keswick Convention sponsored her, and she was sent to China. Of course, you went by boat in those days, and by the time the boat had arrived in Shanghai, her conversations with the captain had led him to come to faith. Her time in China was quite short-lived, and she ended up spending a year working with missionaries in Japan. And it was while she was there that she had experienced something that would shape her entire ministry. She had been asked to go and visit an elderly Japanese woman who was dying. And as she was reading the Bible to her, Amy noticed that the elderly lady was more interested in her Western clothes than what she was hearing from the Bible being read to her. And from that moment on, Amy Carmichael decided that wherever she found herself in the world, she would wear the clothes of the indigenous people there. Once again, she fell ill and she was forced to return to England. And she was back in England for a while, but it was while in England that she sensed a call to go and work in India. And this would become her life work. And having left England for India, she would never return. She served the people of Tamil Nadu, and her initial plan was to go to India as an evangelist, but God had other ideas. And there would be one experience which would shape the next 50 years of her life. One evening, a young girl was brought to her, and her name was Prima, and she was 7 years of age. And Prima had escaped from a nearby temple to which she had been dedicated by her parents as a much younger child. Prima had escaped once before and returned home to her mother, but her mother, because she was afraid of the gods, returned her to the temple. And as punishment, Prima's hands were branded by hot irons. At the time of her second escape, she was only 7 years of age. Prima was part of a practice at that time when young girls were dedicated to a temple and ritually married to a deity. But by the time they were 12 years of age, they had become temple prostitutes. Amy took Prima in for the night, and Prima slowly began to explain to Amy what her life was like in the temple. And when the authorities came to take the girl, Amy refused and stood her ground. And news spread about this incident, and other runaways began to approach Amy for shelter. And within 3 months, she was caring for up to 4 or 5 more children. She would go on to build an orphanage and dedicate herself to being a mother to the children. She cared for their physical and their spiritual needs. They in turn called her Amma, mother for Tamil, and she became an Amma to all who needed one. As I said earlier, she would wear local clothes. At times, she would dye her skin with coffee, which allowed her to enter unobtrusively into the local culture. And God began to use her more and more to rescue as many children as possible. Now, this was not an easy work, and she encountered significant local opposition. She found she was being falsely accused by people to the police, even resistance from other missionaries. And she would write a poem about the struggle. And this poem was given to me when I was a student at Queen's University by another missionary. Her name was Helen Roseveare. And I want to read this poem for you now. It speaks to us of the struggle of following Jesus. From prayer that asks that I may be sheltered from winds that beat on thee, from fearing when I should aspire, from faltering when I should climb higher, from silken self, O Captain, free thy soldier who would follow thee. from subtle love of softening things, from easy choices, weakenings. Not thus are spirits fortified, not this way went the crucified. From all that dims thy Calvary, O Lamb of God, deliver me. Give me the love that leads the way, the faith that nothing can dismay, the hope no disappointments tire, the passion that will burn like fire. Let me not sink to be a clod. Make me thy fuel, flame of God. As time went on, she also began to take in children whose parents had died or children who had been abandoned. And she would go on to build a school and later a hospital to care for the children. She would spend 53 years, the remaining 53 years of her life, caring for these children. And she died at the age of 83. And she requested that her grave would not be marked with a gravestone. Instead, the children placed a bird bath over her grave with the inscription, Amma, Mother. It's estimated that she rescued over 1,000 children. Her orphanage, school, and hospital continue to operate to this day. You can go and visit them. And what I find most interesting is that this orphanage, school, and hospital, they're being run by some of the children that she took in and rescued. Not all of us will be called to a ministry like that of Amy Carmichael, but all of us are called. For some of us, our calling will be very specific. For most of us, our calling will be a blend of many things, from work to home, to friendship, to family, to marriage, to our church. But each and every one of us, as followers of Jesus, we are called. And like Amy, not only are we called, but we are also being prepared. Whether that is the fact that we have brown eyes and not blue eyes, or whether it's the fact that we have one gift and not another. Whether that is the service that we are offering right now that's preparing us for something that's to come, or whether that is a life experience that shapes us right now, preparing us to meet the needs of others in the future. Whether we are seen or unseen, whether we are hidden or public, all of us are called, and all of us continue to be prepared for what the Lord is calling us to. The quote that Amy Carmichael is most famous for is this: "One can give without loving, but one cannot love without giving." And when her children were asked, what is it that drew you to Amy Carmichael, they replied, it was love. Amma loved us. My prayer for us all, it's been my prayer for me today, that the life of Amy Carmichael would inspire me to take seriously the call of God on my life, call of God on your life, and to take seriously what the Lord is doing in us right now in preparation for what he may want to do in us tomorrow. Let's pray.